talking today with Nikolas Badminton, the futurist of futurist.com. Nick is an author. He is a global speaker. He was just telling me about recent travels. And I'm really so thrilled that you agreed to be on this podcast. I can't tell you how excited I am about talking to you. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks for the invite. I mean, I generally say yes to people if they're interested, because, you know, we live in a world where, you know, we need more connection now than ever. We need to share ideas and we need to connect with people all over. So thank you so much for having me, Tracy.
Thank you. And okay, so like I've read about you and I've read your book and I've watched many of your interviews, but tell the audience a little bit about your personal journey. I mean, how did you go from someone who was immersed in punk rock culture to being, you know, to working in corporate America as a foresight consultant? It seems like an unlikely trajectory.
Well, it actually starts a lot further back than me sort of getting into alternative and punk rock music. And at the age of 8, my father bought me a book, which is the Usborne Book of the Future, and it sort of introduced me to an idea of a massively technologically advanced and exponential world. You know, we were going to be living on Mars and traveling to the moon for vacation. We were going to be living under the sea. We were going to have, you know, smart homes, wearable computing, robots, and the Hyperloop everywhere. And it didn't quite come to pass, but it inspired me to think differently. It also inspired me to get really involved in programming computers and the such like. And then a few years later, around about the age of 15, I was sort of a skateboarder, and I was listening to lots of alternative music, and then eventually picked up a guitar, started playing the guitar, then eventually started DJing. And DJing is actually something that I still do and sort of embrace as part of a performative sense of who I am, you know, a creative sense. But it's kind of interesting that those formative years, I would say from the age of 15, probably through like 24. So all the way through college and then university. And I did applied psychology and computing at university, studied philosophy, psychology, computing, artificial intelligence, linguistics. I also had one of my mentors and lecturers was an anarchist. So it was kind of this interesting world. It was the early days of the internet. We were studying all sorts of strange things. I read Douglas Rushkoff's book, Siberia, Life in the Trenches of Cyberspace. You know, all this stuff. So it went from punk rock to cyberpunk very quickly. But really what sort of drew me into that world, and I was already sort of starting to think about, you know, future states of the world. I wasn't calling myself a futurist. No one was calling me a futurist. In fact, futurists were kind of, you know, Bucky Fuller and Alvin Toffler and those kinds of folks. But really, it really gave me a sense that I could be a challenger. I could have non-conventional thinking. I could sort of view the world as a world in collapse, where there is nihilism, where there is disbelief, but a world where we can have hope and we can think about transition, and also how we can sort of push back. I sort of joke in the modern times, you know, the people that I do advise, and I advise everyone from, you know, the White House through to Disney, JP Morgan, whoever, right? A lot of very large companies, over 450 companies and governments. And I sort of say that I'm hired for the things I used to get fired for saying, you know. There's a lot of people out there that are scared of an employee that's truly honest. And truly authentic. And, you know, and I was a management consultant, and then I worked in software. I was in advertising, and, you know, and both in management consultancy and in advertising, you know, they're so desperate to keep hold of clients that they don't want to shake up the barrel or sort of rock the boat. But I'm here to rock the boat and get people thinking, to open their minds and to ignite imagination, build anticipation. We live in a crazy world, and this is why myself as a futurist, my think tank, and the people that I work with are so busy these days, trying to make sense of our crazy world.
That was a lot. I'm remarking that it's not so common that someone should be studying philosophy and psychology and computer programming at the same time. Those don't tend to be the same person who are interested in those worlds.
And in the 90s. So it's just like, you know, so I went to a university called Bournemouth University. It was very small. It was very low ranked, but it was very new, very driven, really smart people, really smart lecturers, just new curriculum that was really challenging the way that we were thinking. I mean, I was building neural networks for pattern recognition of grammar in 1994, 1995 as part of my final year thesis. This was like edgy, interesting stuff. At sort of the master's level, like even, and it sort of opened doors to me because people were like sort of impressed that the thinking was happening, but it came from the people that I was sort of surrounded by, which was, you know, the alternative kids that weren't the normal thinkers. We were the, you know, we thought differently about the world. You know, we didn't fall into Oxford and Cambridge and all that stuff, which, you know, very smart people, very good universities. We were kind of, it was very punk rock in its very nature, right?
Yeah. So what you do is, well, it's super interesting, but it's not the same as, you know, people are employed to forecast trends, let's say.
Sure.
I mean, that's looking at the future. And you kind of put an interesting spin on it. And I love the word dark that you like to use, you know, your thing about dark futures, because I'm actually all about what we call dark consciousness. But tell me about dark futures, because I love this idea of going, I mean, you don't do the obvious thing, which is you know, we're all going to live on Mars and we're going to have homes under the sea and we're going to have flying cars. Right. Like, you're looking at you kind of go into the dystopian side of things.
You know, I look at the deep structural elements of society, how we live, how we think, how we bond and connect, how we operate, how we govern our world. And it's kind of interesting. I've always just had my eyes wide open to what's going on. And dystopia and dystopian things sort of came from the friends that I was hanging out with. I moved to Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada in 2008 from the UK. And after a couple of years, a really good friend of mine that I'd grown up with, skateboarding with, and he's sort of very alternative guy, works in tech, works in augmented reality, guy called Karis O'Connell, moved with the company he was working for at the time, Nokia, to Vancouver. And we rekindled our friendship. We were always very, very close until he sort of quit. He quit college and went off and lived in squats and worked with, you know, and basically hung out running techno raves, ended up in Switzerland running recording studios with people like Dave Bowie and stuff like that. Anyway, he ended up working his way back into technology and innovation and design. And he sort of came up and around, and we started hanging out with a number of other friends, my friends Nick Black and Ryan Betts. And one afternoon, it was around about this time of the year, probably in 2011, we were having some beers and just started to talk about the strangest things that were happening on the planet with technology and sort of the underbelly of the world. So, you know, sharks were chewing down on cables in Thailand because the electrical charges were attracting them, you know, causing massive internet outages, or the psychology or the psychology of recognition of visual characteristics of, you know, the width of shoulders and the width of your chin in men could denote whether you were a cheater or a murderer. very, very strange things that we started, or dark patterns, the dark patterns that were being built into our mobile smartphone devices that meant that we couldn't turn off advertising or work out that when we flicked a switch, if it was on or off or meant something completely different, and all this strange language. And I've always been someone that wants to do events, and I'd sort of run something called Cyborg Camp with Karis and with Amber Case down in Portland. She's now in New York City. Oh, sorry, New York State, I should say. So I was like, you know what, this is interesting. I said, like, you three and me, we're going to do an event. And another friend of ours was working at Microsoft. Microsoft gave us a room. I sold a bunch of tickets for, like, I think $15. And like 60 people turned up, and it was Dark Futures. And it got known to become known as the Black Mirror of TED Talks. And we ended up doing 6 years in Toronto, in Vancouver, eventually in San Francisco as well. And in 2019, I was going to launch it in New York City in early 2020, and obviously the pandemic put a paid to that. And what's interesting is that it was always about the hidden systems in the world. They're there, and we have to be aware of them so that we can prepare for the outcomes of how they operate. Right, some of the products of them operating. You know, from everything from like hacking and cybersecurity through to societal sort of reprogramming through social media or whatever. Ended up doing about 42 different talks. They're all online on YouTube. Just look for Dark Futures, and you can look for my name, and it'll take you to the channel where they are. I think the channel's called. Be interesting that you can look at dystopia, you can look at positive.
You just missed it. It cut out when you said what the channel was called. That's a very dark thing to happen, but
okay. So the channel. One second, I'm going to turn off my phone.
We've got a lot of noise from your whatever's going on your desk. It's coming through on the.
Excuse me, like it keeps switching the microphone here. What am I? I'm going to. Yeah, 1 second. I'm sorry. I'm going to turn off my.
I don't hear you at all now. No, not yet. Hmm. If we can't get back, sometimes if you pop out and come back in. Yeah, I can't. Yeah, exactly. You just go out and come back in.
The channel Dark Futures, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got about 42 different talks like on the channel on YouTube. Like it's called Dark Futures. It all came to an end in 2019 because in 2020, obviously, the pandemic sort of had the meltdown, and we were sort of partway through the Trump administration. It was all really interesting. We kind of find ourselves in a world that is typified by sort of an open book of dark futures. So the whole event, I tried to rekindle it in 2022. No one's interested.
Yeah.
No,
dude, we're living it. We don't need to go to a conference about it.
I sent a screenshot of the front of the New York Times app to a friend of mine last week, and where they were talking about the dark futures. So that's it. It's over. It's in the mainstream. We don't need conferences about that. And that kind of like ushered me towards something that was a lot more unbridled in terms of like possibilities, positivity, and hope. And that's where I kind of am. I've written the book about dystopian thinking and thinking about positive possible futures. In the book, Facing Our Futures did really well, and lots of people still really like it, especially people in the foresight and futures community, right? Which is great. It's a very process heavy book. My new book I'm reading is called The Hope Playbook, and it's about using hope as an energy for change.
Oh, wow.
And it's a lot more powerful. And yes, sure, the world can be tricky, but the antithesis to tricky and dark and hidden and dystopian is hopeful. And I think that's where I want to put my energy these days. And I think it's where the world needs help the most.
I was going to ask you, because this is, well, it interests me a great deal, the dystopian view, because in the coaching and mentoring transformational work that I do,
right,
it's very much about digging into a kind of worst case scenario,
sure,
in a very specific way, and I feel like that is almost a necessary doorway into hope and into the brighter future, let's say. So it's just interesting that that we come at it from a different, yours is very much systemic and societal, global sort of thinking, and mine is very much on an individual sort of personal psychology consciousness level. But it's a required passage to get to a consciousness about the worst thing that could happen, in order to unpack, like to face it and look at it, and then be able to unpack the more positive vision, the unlimited vision, the limit. Like that's what we're talking about here, is the limitless vision. The access to that is through the doorway of the worst case scenario.
And also, the gift that is hopelessness. There's a lot of thinking out there and talks. There's a guy called Slavoj Zizek, very rambunctious philosopher, Eastern European guy, hilarious guy as well. And, talking about how hopelessness takes us to a point where there is only one way forward, and that's back into a world of hope. Right. And I think that it is important. I think we must reflect. I mean, we live in a world where we're all living with trauma in one sense or another, or trauma is sort of is sprung upon us in multiple different ways. I would also argue that whatever political event happens, or whatever sort of transgresses through technology or personal interactions, is ultimately just an amplification of our own trauma that we carry anyway. So that's it, right? So hope is also something that can be a very practical tool, but it does come through a journey of seeing how bad it could be. I mean, the book that I'm writing is not about going on that journey. The positive dystopian framework that I put in my book, Facing Our Futures, absolutely is an investigation of how bad it could be. We could almost see our present world as being a dystopic reality and a roadmap, right? Yeah. We've got very few people that are in power, the majority of them men. Decisions being made on solutions where there's not really problems to solve, or problems that we have are being ignored. We're not given ownership and agency to be part of this new world, and everyone's climbing over the dead bodies to get to the top of the pyramid, right? And I don't want to get too dark on this, but like on the flip side of that is the billions of people that are raising families, that are building businesses, that really are trying to do well, that are trying to operate in economies and sort of keep governments true and honest to what we need, right? And I think that's really very important.
I was really, I agree with you 100%. And of course, like I said, my end of things is the personal outlook, the personal mindset.
Yeah.
That gets people through their own hopelessness into the limitlessness of reality, because the hopelessness is always an illusion, right? It is always an illusion, and it's about getting through to where you can see the possibilities, the opportunities, the room for growth, the way out. Like the way out is what we're always looking for. Always. But I was I love this quote, and I hope I'm not getting it wrong, but it's from Dator's second law of the future.
Yeah.
Right? Any useful idea of the future should appear ridiculous.
Yes.
I love that so much.
Yeah.
It's one of the, well, anyway, I won't go down my rabbit hole with that, but please talk about the futures cone, because that's like, as a futurist tool, I just think that's so fascinating.
I think every business leader, and certainly every futurist, should be aware of Jim Dator and the work that he did in the University of Hawaii School of Manoa, and the futures work that he did. He pioneered a lot of the thinking. In fact, I was going to bring up that particular law as we were talking, so you sort of got ahead of the game. You talk about the futures cone. Very simply, the cone of possibilities is something that looks across a number of different kinds of futures, and how we look ahead. I sort of unpacked this in a podcast that I did with Dr. Joseph Voros that sort of evolved it somewhat, and really, out of all the different kinds, there's plausible, possible, there's all different flavors of futures. I find it completely useless as a business tool because there's so much nuance that, I've never put it in a keynote. I've never sat down with an executive to try and describe, the plurality of our futures and the nuance. Because actually, if we simply think about the way forward, it's about possibility, right? What we can actually, influence to make happen. But you also, I think in the show notes, as you sent to me, you really love preposterous, and I do too, which is that idea of, the data's second law of the future. Any useful idea about the future must at first sight appear ridiculous. And it really does. And I sort of really embrace that preposterous side of things, because there are so many people that say, we're never going to have a world where there's going to be flying cars. There's never going to be a world of autonomous driving. There's never going to be a world where psychedelics are going to be a normal part of pharmacological therapy. We're never going to have a world where, kids are going to freeform creativity and imagination as their education, blah, 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 right? And never say never. I remind clients, never say never, because it fundamentally fights against the idea of progress and of hope itself. And sometimes we get sort of mired in the memory and history and nostalgia of what went before. It's always been done this way is probably the beginning of your business slowly declining into obsolescence and eventual death.
Yeah.
To quote Jeff Bezos and his day two philosophy, right? It's kind of interesting, right? That when we start to think about that, it's interesting. So sure, the futures cone is there. Go and look at my discussion about that, both in my book and in the podcast I've got with Joe Voros. But it's an interesting academic exercise rather than a practical business tool. So, I'm focused on possibility thinking and futures thinking and hope as a structural piece that looks at, setting, audacious goals, declarations and pathways forward, and giving agency to people to make it happen, right? So yeah, that's where I sort of lie with the futures cone. And there's lots of models. There's so many different cones and models and everything in futures work that, I would say that the exercises, the workshops and everything, incredibly valuable when it comes down to strategic implementation of futures thinking. A simplicity in a statement about what we want within a strategic statement within an organization is the most powerful thing that we can do as futurists and people that work with futures, because it provides a framing that's really important. And companies that do have a framing and a set of vigilance and a capability that looks at signals and trends and scenarios and sort of tells stories of our futures, that vigilance means higher profit, faster growth, and larger market capitalization as a whole. So there's real value there. I mean, that's what I teach executives. That's what I teach in my keynotes to tens of thousands of people every year, and hopefully some of it sticks. And the book that I'm writing, the Hope Playbook, is very much about a simplistic way to integrate hopeful futures and ideas of what comes next, and a new target for our businesses and governments to attain in a very easy way, right? And we all know an easy way is fairly seamless in its integration and fluid in the way that we can make it happen.
Well, it should definitely be easy, because the complicated way doesn't tend to work, right?
Well, how do you teach a complicated way?
But we make everything too complicated in general, right?
I mean, I've got a very nuanced framework that I've used in facing our futures. It's actually not too difficult to teach, but putting clients through the sausage machine,
yeah,
is rough. It's hard because you're fundamentally challenging everything they believe about the world today and taking them into a new area where they haven't really used imagination in a business sense for almost their entire careers. And it does take time, you know? So, you know, we'll do that hard work. You know, the futurists and the think tanks will do the hard work, and we'll write the white papers, we'll work directly with the executives, and we'll, you know, put in the principles that really establish, you know, good futures capabilities in modern organizations.
I'm going to guess also that the successful implementation of your strategies and frameworks are going to require also some like personal transformative movement of the individuals involved there, because you are challenging their view of the world. You're challenging their loyalty to the way that things have always been done, to whatever they did to get the success that they have now.
Yeah.
They're going to have to let go of some of that to move forward, and that's challenging on a personal level for those individuals in leadership positions.
I mean, you have to give them permission to change and permission to care, right? This is the agency part of things. Give them permission to take action, right? To do things, rather than put them in a box and tell them, you know how to work. I mean, there's lots of discussions around automation and robotics right now. We've basically already made a majority of our workforces robotic. So it's just a matter of time before they're completely replaced. You know, algorithmic work, you know, click one thing, click another thing, send an email, build a spreadsheet, you know, process data, add a comment. Just that groundwork, it's all going to be automated, right? Because it's already robotic. Right, the robot, the word robot, I think, is a Czechoslovakian for slave.
Wow.
We can get really heavy, but it's kind of interesting, right? As we sort of dig into what robotic AI and the such like sort of bring to our modern world, right? So it's we're an inflection point. We need to work out who we are, how we operate, what we want to do in business, and why are there so many people that want to break out of the mold and do their own things. It's because they're fed up being told what to do. I mean, it happened to me about 15 years ago, and I'm never going to work for anyone ever again, right? And luckily, my business is incredibly, you know, it's doing a lot of work and being pretty successful at having an influence in this crazy world.
That's so great to hear. That is great to hear. I'm curious to know about where we're headed, because we just touched on this.
Yeah.
In terms of the evolution of consciousness itself, because that's the world that I work in. Maybe with the, you know, influence of technology, here we are, like AI is a real thing. Everybody's got it in their pocket now.
Yeah.
You know, what's next for the human experience of consciousness?
Just a small question. Hey, Tracy. At university, we studied consciousness a lot, and we thought about consciousness in the world of machines. And this is the 90s, and I still think about it a lot. I've personally gone on a journey of exploring my own belief systems and consciousness through shamanic journeying with various things like ayahuasca and the such like, and also through therapy, you know, EMDR, you know, tapping therapy. Cool. I've used Psych K to program subconscious belief systems using NLP, you know, healing the inner child, the whole thing. I actively do this as a sort of a biohacker and someone that cares about, you know, what I pass along to my kids and in the relationships I have, both personal and from a business perspective. And it does lead me to, I don't really think about consciousness per se, but everything I think about and everything I do leads into a wider world of consciousness. And you have to have a responsibility in knowing that every little thing you do feeds up into a wider world consciousness. And I think it's really important to find the people that sort of share your belief systems. Sure, you create an echo chamber, but if you create a really good echo chamber, it can actually ripple through the world and have a very large positive effect.
Well, that was a very nice and quick and easy answer to that question.
I do think about it a lot, but what is consciousness is still the biggest challenge. There are some people starting to unpack this using sub-symbolic artificial intelligence. Susan Gilder in Vancouver, British Columbia, was at Sanctuary AI, and she was at Kindred before that, and she's got a company called Nirvanic AI, and I think it's quite an early stage company, but she's starting to think about AI and consciousness. There's definitely a conversation to be had there with her, I feel.
Yeah, I will look her up for sure.
As you start to unpack all of the data that we store in our world, there's elements and there's hints about what our consciousness is, because the technologies that we use, smartphones or whatever, they amplify who we are. They really reveal who we are.
That's it exactly.
Yeah, people like Chris Dancy, the most connected man in the world, or most connected person in the world, I should say, is a great person to chat to about that as well. And we don't realize that these devices that we use actually do reveal so much about who we are. And to really embrace that, I think, is a real gift. We have to be careful because the algorithms are out there trying to make us someone else that wants to buy, comedy socks and and all sorts of fast frying cooking utensils.
Yeah. I've been playing a little bit with AI just as a consumer, on my computer or whatever, and it can be a little daunting and frightening sometimes, but I am hopeful. I'm engaging in hope that this is going to have a transformative effect on individuals, that it's going to give us permission and maybe free us up to amplify the more human parts of ourselves, that we can outsource a lot of things now to a tool, and that will give space for us to really amplify what is most human about us.
The world needs techno shaman right now. I actually play in the world of sort of hokey sort of magic and the such like. Fun fact: my Futurist.com logo system. There's 4 logos: signals, trends, scenarios, and stories. They're actually sigils, so they're actually magic.
Oh, wonderful! Oh, I love that.
Yeah, they're actually magic symbols. Not many people.
So cool. That is so cool to hear. Well,
I grew up in the strange Isle of Wessex in the southwest of England that was mired in the occult and magic druids and such like, and mornings of the solstice at Stonehenge. So it sort of comes back to me a little bit in the practice that I have, right? And I do think that it's really important to sort of dive into some of that alternative thinking. Paganism is the indigenous nature of the British, right? And I sort of dive into that a little bit in Facing Our Futures. And indigenous cultures and indigenous thinking around the world must be paid attention to, because it cares about people, planet, responsibility, and a more hopeful future than ever before.
We totally have to keep talking. This conversation could go on and on, but I want to thank you very much for doing this. This was fascinating to talk to you. Tell whoever's listening, once again, of course, I'll put it in the show notes, but the best way to get in touch with you?
Futurist.com. There's a big fat contact button.
Lovely website.
Yeah, thank you. Nikolas at futurist.com. Super easy. There's only 2 Nikolas Badmintons in the world, one spelt with a K, that's me, and looks like me. So the other guy is in South Africa. He's a very well-known business person, but it definitely isn't me. So don't contact him, because he's not going to be able to talk to you about futures like I can.
Well, thank you so much for doing this, and we'll keep talking.
Yeah, we certainly will. Thank you, Tracy.